we'll have another video that we did with Christian Krupke. It's on corn rootworms. So I'll get that up here in a second.
I'm standing beside a conventional cornfield at Pinney Purdue Research Farm. It's August the 7th, and the reason I'm standing here, what we're going to talk about today, is an old familiar pest that hasn't been much of an issue in the past few years, and that's the western corn rootworm. And this planting that I'm standing beside is part of a research trial that, among other things, is looking at how long it is before you have western corn rootworm showing up in unprotected conventional corn. And I'll get to more details about the answer to that in a moment, but what we found this year is that many producers have gone with conventional hybrids. And that's a departure from past years, and it's probably due to a combination of weak commodity prices and low pest pressures that we've had over the past few years. And so some producers are taking advantage of that opportunity to move away from the BT hybrids, away from those tech fees, to conventional hybrids. And one of the purposes of this session today is to remind everybody that that choice is fine, but western corn rootworm hasn't gone anywhere. And protecting yourself against that pest is still something you're going to have to consider if you're going with conventional corn. Now, nationwide, we're still probably at 85% or so of corn is a BT hybrid, BT corn. Many of those hybrids are stacked with above ground pest traits, so your corn earworms, corn borer, western bean cutworm in some cases, and your below ground pests, which are just the corn rootworm. So the vast majority of corn in the US is still planted that way. But we are seeing a move and an opening for conventional corn hybrids. If you plant untreated conventional corn, there's nothing preventing rootworms from feeding on that corn. And what we've seen is that you can get by doing that for a year or two or possibly even 3. But at some point, you're going to have enough damage and enough rootworm feeding that you're going to have corn that's lodged in the field. And that's what we've seen this year. With some of the heavier rains in the past 2 or 3 weeks, followed by some heavier winds, we've seen a lot of lodged corn. That's one indicator that rootworm feeding has been heavy. By the time you see that, it's too late to do anything. Nothing can be done to preserve that year's corn roots or to stand that corn up again or anything like that. The other indicator, and what we saw in this field a couple of weeks ago, is a lot of adult rootworms. And corn rootworms as larvae only feed on one thing in the Midwest, and that's corn roots. So if you have a lot of corn rootworms in a field, it's a good bet that they came out of that field that you're standing in, because they only move, like most insects, most animals, they only move as far as they have to get some nutrition. Now, as adults, they'll feed on a variety of things, not just corn, but they do feed on corn leaves, which is inconsequential, but we'll show that in a minute. They do feed on corn tassels, and they usually are synced up with pollination time. So in some cases, there's enough silk clipping that an adult spray will have to be applied. That's not usually the case in Indiana, hasn't been for a long time, but it's certainly not unheard of in the past. If you go back 15, 20 years, you'll hear more cases of silk clipping to the extent that adult insecticide had to be applied. But today we're mostly focusing on the larval stage, what to do if you have lodged corn in the field, and how to assess steps for next year in terms of rootworm management if you need to do something differently. Now, as I mentioned, adult rootworm feeding will occur in corn and out of corn. The main thing that they're after is pollen. That's their main food source, especially for females that are developing eggs. But they'll also feed on the leaves, as you see here. We call this window painting. Here's a couple of rootworms just flew in and out of this shot here. And they will feed on leaves, but leaves aren't a great source of nutrition. But when you see this, these stripes are characteristic. They don't chew holes so much as just take all the green out, and we call this window painting feeding, and it's usually in strips when it's rootworm feeding. That's fairly diagnostic. Now this level of feeding is nowhere close to economic. This plant has more than enough green leaves to do whatever it needs to in terms of photosynthesis for the rest of the year. All this does is tell you somebody's been here, rootworms have been here feeding. That's what this is an indication of. This kind of feeding is diagnostic of rootworm feeding, and as you can see, it's on a lower leaf, which is even less consequential. You can see as this leaf sits here, a lot of it is shaded out anyway by leaves that are up above, and so that means that the sunlight is hitting those leaves and there's photosynthesis happening. So there's rootworm feeding on leaves is nothing to be concerned about. Rootworm feeding on silks is when we worry. We're well past that stage now, of course, but that would be the only way that rootworm adults would be something that you would want to manage. Yeah. Male and female rootworms look very similar. The western corn rootworm, the males have black on most of their wing covers, or elytra. They don't have defined stripes, whereas the female has a central stripe and one black stripe on either side on a yellow background. Okay. Male and female rootworms will be around for most of the rest of the summer. Female rootworms will be laying eggs in cornfields until well after Labor Day, and sometimes until the first frost. And during that time, they'll also be feeding on pollen from a wide variety of weedy plants. If you happen to have squash or zucchini or melon flowers, any of that family of plants nearby, those are especially favored by adult rootworms that are looking for food. And in fact, sometimes can be used as a trap crop for them when we do our research trials. All right, if you suspect you have rootworm feeding, for example, if you have lodged corn, especially if it's conventional corn or unprotected corn, if you have lodged corn, a lot of beetles in the field, the most important thing to do is to dig some corn roots to look for the larval feeding. Now, as we stand here in early to mid-August, it's a little bit late because there's been some root regrowth, so you won't see the feeding as well. But if we did this about 3 weeks or a month ago, would be the perfect time. But what I'm going to do now is just demonstrate simply what you do. You just dig up a corn root, chop the stalk off, and I'll show you some of what to look for on the root itself. So I'm going to work on an edge plant here, but that is never what you should do. Plants on the edges are not representative for a number of reasons, but just for filming purposes, I'm going to work on the edge. But you would always want to walk in 10 feet or so and then do multiple areas of the field. And the more plants, the better. You would want to do in an area with a lot of lodging, 5 or 10 plants would be a minimum. Again, more would be better. But I'm just going to do a plant on the edge here just to show you how to pop a root out of the ground. Not that it's difficult, but there's some tips that you have to be aware of. So let's dig this plant up. All right, now at this point you'll have a large ball of soil, and depending on how wet it's been, that ball may be pretty heavy and muddy. The next thing you'll have to do is get a 5-gallon bucket full of water, dip this root ball in there and just dunk it in and out as many times as you have to get some of this mud off of there. A garden hose is handy too to spray in here and pressure wash basically this root off, and then you'll be able to see the actual roots and look if there's damage there. So I have a couple of roots I've already dug here, and I'm just going to show you one of them here. You can see this is a pretty anemic little root mass, but what you would want to look for is on some of the interior roots is signs of feeding and scarring that would be due to insect feeding. Now there's nothing else that will cause scars and feeding tubes or feeding marks in a corn root. That would be all you would ever find in terms of the rootworm would be the only insect you would ever find causing that kind of damage. So this one here is fairly clean. Recording. All right, this is root here was dug out of this field that had a lot of rootworm activity in it. So there's no doubt these roots were fed upon. But now that we're here in August, we can't really see what happened on this particular root, but what you do see is a lot of fine roots. This is newer, adventitious root growth, and this often happens after root damage from rootworm feeding if you have moist conditions, which we did. In the last 3 weeks or so, we've had abundant rainfall here, and that's just like if you take a cup plant and you put it in water, it'll grow roots back. These corn roots can grow back as well. And you may not lose any yield at all, even after severe rootworm feeding, if there's abundant water afterwards. Where you can lose some in terms of harvest is the difficulty in picking up that downed corn at with the combine equipment. But this here, all this root growth here makes it almost impossible to dig down and see where rootworm feeding has occurred. And that means that work has to be done right after the feeding. You can see here, I've isolated one root here. And you can see these grooves and some dark brown or necrotic tissue, and that's where the feeding has scarred over. And then look at all this new growth here on the end. Look at all of that. That's that plant responding to a lack of moisture and to a lack of root material and growing roots back when it can get moisture and where it can get to moisture. So this here was a response to rootworm feeding, and that plant can then not necessarily have yield loss, probably usually will from severe feeding. But the point here is that root dig has to be done in a timely manner. Mid-July to late July is the period when you would see the damage. After that, you'll get this regrowth and you'll just be having to dig in and do too much guesswork. All right, so as I mentioned at the top of this video, we have had more cases this year than in many years of a lot of rootworm feeding in conventional, unprotected corn. That's not too surprising, but what we want to focus on is what to do about it. Now, the first option, if you have a field like that, and this is an option that's available to most Indiana growers, but not all, is rotate to another crop like soybeans. So in a soybean field, assuming volunteer corn is controlled, you'll have a lot of rootworm eggs hatch. They'll look for a food source. They'll only find soybeans, and they'll all die. 100% of all the rootworms who don't find a corn plant in that field will die. That's the most effective technique. For some, that's not an option. For some, continuous corn is dictated by local markets and dairy and so forth. And in those cases, you do need to protect that corn. So if you still want to stay with conventional corn, there are tools. There are granular and liquid insecticides that work. They still work. They never have stopped working. There are several that you can find at our Purdue website, Purdue Corn Insect Management Recommendations. You'll find an up-to-date listing of those, both by active ingredient and by trade name. And those fell out of favor about 10 or 15 years ago, only because the transgenic hybrids are so much easier to handle and became so popular so quickly. But they never stopped working. The efficacy is still there. So if that's an option that you need to pursue, then those are still there for you. But the point is, going with conventional corn that is unprotected is a recipe for disaster. It may not be in year 1 or even in year 2, but the rootworms have never left. They're still out there, and they will find that unprotected corn, and we're seeing this year can cause quite a bit of damage in there. All right, I'm standing beside a soybean field that is adjacent to the field of conventional corn, unprotected, loaded with rootworm beetles. Now, many of you may have heard of the rotation-resistant variant or the soybean variant of the corn rootworm. It's common in most of Indiana, including where we are here. And what that means is all of these beetles that came out of this corn, they'll try and mate and lay eggs, and those females will not just lay eggs in corn. They've lost their fidelity, their faithfulness to only laying eggs in corn. So they'll dump their eggs all around us here. If we had a wheat crop, they'd even lay eggs in that. But there will be, you can be sure, there will be many eggs in this soybean field from corn rootworms. So what that means is if corn comes in here next year, which it will, if that corn isn't protected, you will have problems. If corn comes into this conventional corn next year, you'll have problems as well. So the point of what I'm getting at here is that if you have a field where you have a lot of rootworm beetles emerging for whatever reason, you need to be aware that the entire surrounding area is going to have a lot of rootworm pressure in terms of eggs next spring. So if you rotate after soybeans and you come in with corn, there will be eggs waiting for you. If, on the other hand, you come in with soybeans after corn, there will be eggs waiting for you, but it's something that you don't have to worry about. They can't feed on soybeans.